If you're one of the more adventurous gardeners that really wants a ton of butterflies, you're gonna wanna watch this video. I consider this a plant for experienced gardeners. Not because it's hard to grow, the problem is it might be a little too easy to grow. It's Pye Weed. Pye Weed is one of the busiest flowers in my garden, with bees and butterflies all over the flowers, birds perching on the stems. It's really one of my favorites. If you have Pye Weed, you're gonna have bees and butterflies guaranteed. Why it's great. First off, obviously this is a stunning flower. It's not just one flower, but hundreds of clusters of tiny flowers with wispy petals that turn it into this soft cloud of color. The stems are strong and upright, and when Pye Weed is in a cluster, it looks like a giant bouquet of purple flower heads. I love seeing a clearing in a forest with a cluster of Pye Weed looking gorgeous in the otherwise shady woods. This plant is a stunner, like 9 out of 10 for natural beauty. But most of us don't plant Pye Weed just for the beauty, because there's another miraculous power it has in our garden, and that's how much it's loved by nature. In particular, butterflies. Like, I went online to find some stock footage of Pye Weed so that I could show you some professional photos, and they all had pictures of tiger swallowtails and monarchs on them. I followed this tiger swallowtail in a Pye Weed planting in a subdivision near my home that has an HOA. They must have had gardeners on the board who really understand the benefits of bringing butterflies to the neighborhood. Not only butterflies, but bees love to nectar on this plant, and I catch them in the morning sleeping under the shelter of Pye Weed blooms. Bumblebees sleep clinging to the underside of the flowers, and they wake up when the sun comes up and starts to warm them up in the morning. They're busy bees during the day, and then they come back to the Pye Weed at night to sleep. There are few other pollinator plants that are as good as Pye Weed for the garden, because it brings all kinds of pollinators like bees, tiny bees, bumblebees, monarchs, swallowtails, moths. Birds like to hang out in the stems. The birds are there to feed on insects that are drawn in by the Pye Weed. It creates a whole ecosystem. Have you ever thought about how few leaves in nature are actually edible to us? We evolved some pretty good ways to get nutrition from things like lettuce, spinach, Swiss chard, collard greens. We can eat things like parsley and basil, but we can't get almost any nutrition from things like oak leaves, grass, things like pine needles. In fact, a lot of the leaves in our environment are actually poisonous for us to eat. A lot of those leaves would make us really sick. Those plants developed bitter tasting tannins and other chemicals that would really hurt our stomachs. Look out in your yard and see what percentage of the leaves in your yard you think that you could actually eat. And you'll see that it's actually pretty low. Well, butterfly caterpillars are the exact same as us. Caterpillars just can't eat any plant from around the world. They can only eat the leaves of a few species, like us. Pye Weed is actually an overachiever as a native plant because its leaves can be eaten by 3 dozen species of butterflies. That means if you plant Pye Weed in your yard, you're going to influence the amount of butterflies your entire neighborhood can have. And that's the kind of influencer I want to be. Not only do butterflies lay their eggs on Pye Weed leaves, but tiny native bees can lay eggs or overwinter in the hollow stems of the Pye Weed. While, yeah, maybe the stems don't look that attractive in the wintertime, they are crucial habitat for little insects that use them over the winter. It's like a little Airbnb that they just use for the wintertime. It keeps them safe over the winter so they can emerge in the spring. That's why it's important to leave these stems up until late spring, so you can be sure that all the bees have had a chance to come out on their own time. By June, new shoots are going to be growing fast on the Pye Weed, and you can remove the stems if you want and start the season fresh. As a native plant, Pye Weed is really easy to care for since it's very strong and knows exactly how to survive in our soil and our weather. It stores most of its energy in its roots every year, so that even if it gets eaten to the ground by deer in early spring and summer, it's going to have no problem pushing up new roots and growing to its full size. It's so easy to care for. It doesn't need any soil amendments or fertilizers. In fact, if you give it fertilizer, you're going to have to ask yourself if you really want this thing to grow larger than 6 or 7 feet tall. If you artificially make it grow taller by adding a nitrogen fertilizer, it's probably going to collapse under its own weight. It's going to get so huge. It's best to just let it do its own thing. Check out this specimen I saw in the wild. It looks like it's probably 25% eaten by caterpillars. This is what success looks like in the native garden. These are butterfly caterpillars eating the leaves. So you're basically growing butterflies. If you have a Pye Weed, you're basically a butterfly farmer. You can put that on your resume. Things that are important to know. Although there's 6 different species of Joe Pye weed that I found on the BALM website, that's a website of North American native plants. Usually there's only 2 different kinds of Joe Pye weed that you're going to be able to find in the garden center for sale. There's the purple Joe Pye weed, also known as sweet Joe Pye weed. This is Eupatorium purpureum. Purpureum, like purple. This tolerates some shade. The flowers are a more purple color. This is great for like woodland clearings, the edge of a forest. This is a very common one that you're gonna see in the woods, where there's a little bit of a clearing and some sun is coming through the canopy. You're gonna see a cluster of Joe Pye weed. The second one I want to talk about is spotted Joe Pye weed, or Eupatorium maculatum. This is a full sun wetland plant, so it likes moist soils, it loves to be in full sun, and the flowers are a little bit more pink. This is great for a full sun rain garden. If you're walking through the woods and you want to identify a Joe Pye weed, you can notice that its leaves are whorled.
Cool whip? Cool whip, yeah, cool whip. You're saying it weird.
They're around in a circle. So some plants are like bilaterally symmetrical, so it's got 2 sides. Joe Pye weed is not like that. Joe Pye weed has leaves that are all around in a circle. And so when you look at it, it does look a little bit different than most of the plants that you'll see. The leaves have like a toothed edge, kind of like a serrated knife. The leaves are a deep blue-green color. And when it's blooming, it's tall and it looks like this. It's pretty easy to identify, but there's a couple of things about it that are not so easy. Why it can be a problem. It needs space and competition because it's tall. Look, this plant is 7 feet tall. I'm not exaggerating. And it likes to form colonies of itself, all right? Just like all tall native plants, it's used to having a lot of competition in the forest and prairie, so they compensate with all this competition by trying to grow taller than the other plants. So when it's planted by itself, it can kind of splay open like tall roses in a tiny vase. Here in my yard, I have some competition for the Joe Pye weed, but not quite enough. And so it's reaching away from the fence and it's kind of leaning into the other plants I have in the backyard. I didn't give it a ton of space, so it is flopping a little bit. I don't think this looks bad, but my backyard is not going to be a show garden anytime soon. Since I don't care about it looking like a show garden, I tolerate the flopping because for me, the wildlife benefit is so huge that it's worth it. As long as my husband doesn't mind, I'm happy to have it look a little funky. He loves it too. The size and display of the flowers that brings so many butterflies and birds, that's really a priority for us, and we just love having wildlife in our backyard. So what's the solution to this problem? Well, this isn't always an option for everyone, but having enough space. If you have a large yard that can hold a stand of Joe Pye weed surrounded by other native plants, your Joe Pye weed will probably stand up nice and straight. Here's a picture of a property that does have Joe Pye weed standing up straight, and you can see they like to form a cluster, and they are also surrounded by other native plants, and so they're standing upright. There is another option. You can trim the Joe Pye weed back early in the year, like in June. This is known as the Chelsea chop. Chelsea chop is where you cut your perennials by half in early June in order to get them to grow in a more bushy habit. I've done this successfully with asters, like New England aster that gets kind of tall. I've done it with ironweed, and I tried this with Joe Pye weed. So it did shorten the stems, but then they just branched out and grew sideways. It definitely wasn't compact. So instead of a shorter plant, I just had like this bushy plant that was growing further and further out into the yard. I decided that this isn't for me with Joe Pye weed, but some people do this every year and they swear by it. Some things in the garden just need to be experimented with, and just because I don't like it doesn't mean that it won't work for you, so it might be worth a try. Also, it seeds everywhere. Joe Pye weed is really easy to grow, but it's so easy that it will give you seedlings everywhere, all over the yard. The tufts of seeds are very light and airy, so if the wind blows, it can really send these seeds pretty far into your yard and your neighbor's yard. These seedlings will try to form their own Joe Pye weed colonies unless you keep an eye on them. The solution to this is to pull seedlings diligently and deadhead the seed heads in the fall. In 2023, I deadheaded all the Joe Pye weed and I gathered the seeds for scattering elsewhere, and I still had seedlings the next year. So it's also likely that your neighbors are gonna have Joe Pye weed growing in their yard, so it ain't all bad. I have Joe Pye Weed in my yard, and I love the benefits so much that I don't mind that it tends to flop over and overshadow some other plants. I deadhead, I pull seedlings regularly. To me, it's worth it to have a plant that gives me so much wildlife in my yard. So tell me in the comments, are you thinking you might want to add Joe Pye Weed to your yard this year? Or maybe you already have it and you can share your tips with us. Have you ever tried the Chelsea chop? Feel free to ask any questions you'd like in the comments. I'm thinking of maybe doing a Q&A, and then I'll take the questions from the comments and answer them in the Q&A.